Russia deploys 15 warships to block the northern sea route. America responds with a $3 billion icebreaker and a message written in steel. November 2nd, 2025. The Arctic Circle, 420 nautical miles north of Norway. At 2:15 p.m., in waters where the sun barely rises above the horizon and temperatures plunge to minus 30 degrees Celsius, 15 Russian warships formed a blockade across the northern sea route. This wasn't a training exercise. This was a territorial declaration. Russia, emboldened by melting ice caps that had opened previously impassable shipping lanes, was claiming exclusive control over a maritime corridor that shaves 7,000 miles off the journey between Europe and Asia. The economic implications were staggering. Control of the northern sea route meant control over 15% of future global shipping. It meant billions in transit fees. It meant geopolitical leverage over every nation dependent on Arctic commerce. And Russia, with the world's largest icebreaker fleet and military bases stretching across the Arctic coastline, believed it could enforce this claim through intimidation. The blockade was formidable. 3 Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates, each armed with Kaliber cruise missiles and torpedoes, 4 Staroguzhty-class corvettes bristling with anti-ship weapons, 2 Udaloy-class destroyers dating from the Cold War but still lethal, and 6 auxiliary vessels, including icebreakers converted for military use. In total, over 2,000 Russian sailors stationed in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Their mission clear: turn back any vessel, military or civilian, that attempted to transit the route without Russian authorization. For 3 days, the blockade held. Commercial shipping companies rerouted vessels through the traditional Suez Canal route, adding weeks to delivery times and millions in fuel costs. NATO held emergency consultations. The United Nations Maritime Organization lodged protests, but Russia remained unmoved. The northern sea route was closed, and Moscow dared the world to challenge it. At 8 a.m. on November 5th, the challenge arrived. Emerging from thick fog 80 miles to the west, the USCGC Polar Sentinel, America's newest heavy icebreaker worth $3 billion, carved through 6-foot-thick ice at 15 knots. She was a titanium and steel fortress, 460 feet long, displacing 16,000 tons, and capable of breaking ice up to 21 feet thick. Her diesel-electric propulsion system generated 60,000 horsepower. Her bow, reinforced with hardened steel plating, could smash through barriers that would stop any conventional ship. And escorting her, just beyond the ice pack, were 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the USS Roosevelt and USS Porter, their Aegis systems active, and their crews at battle stations. The United States had not come to negotiate. It had come to break the blockade, enforce freedom of navigation, and remind Russia that the Arctic Ocean was not a Russian lake. What's your call in this scenario? Type A if you'd send the icebreaker alone to avoid escalation. Type B if you'd send a full carrier group to show overwhelming force. Drop your tactical choice below. At 8:42 a.m., Russian radar detected the American convoy. On the bridge of the Admiral Golovko, the lead Russian frigate, the captain received orders from Northern Fleet Command. Intercept the icebreaker. Block its path. Use minimum force necessary, but do not allow passage. 3 frigates and 2 corvettes broke formation, steaming toward the Polar Sentinel at maximum speed. Their mission was intimidation through proximity. Russian doctrine called for aggressive close-quarters maneuvering, crossing bow to stern, forcing foreign vessels to alter course or risk collision. It was a tactic perfected during Cold War confrontations, designed to test an opponent's resolve without firing a shot. But the Polar Sentinel was not a nervous freighter captain who could be bullied. She was a United States Coast Guard cutter, operating under military command, and her orders were explicit. Maintain course, maintain speed, do not deviate. At 9:10 a.m., the first Russian frigate closed to within 1,000 yards, positioning herself directly in the Polar Sentinel's path. The icebreaker's captain, a veteran of 25 years Arctic operations, didn't flinch. He maintained 15 knots, the massive bow cutting through ice that would shred the frigate's thin hull if the Russian ship didn't move. At 400 yards, the frigate's captain realized the Americans were not bluffing. He turned hard to starboard, narrowly avoiding collision. The Polar Sentinel plowed past, her wake rocking the smaller Russian vessel. Round 1 to the United States. But Russia escalated. At 9:25 a.m., 2 corvettes attempted a coordinated maneuver, approaching from port and starboard simultaneously. Their goal was to bracket the Icebreaker, forcing it to slow or turn. But they had miscalculated. The Polar Sentinel's ice-hardened hull was built to withstand impacts that would sink conventional warships. Her captain called their bluff, maintaining course as both corvettes were forced to veer away at the last second. One corvette, turning too sharply on ice-slicked water, nearly capsized before recovering. On the USS Roosevelt, 15 miles to the south, the crew watched the confrontation unfold on radar displays. Fire control systems tracked every Russian ship. The destroyer's 5-inch gun could reach targets 13 miles away. Her Harpoon anti-ship missiles had a range of 80 miles. And her SM-6 missiles could strike surface targets at ranges exceeding 200 miles. The Russians knew this. Every maneuver they made was monitored, analyzed, and countered before it happened. The Americans held every advantage except one. They were not in Russian waters. This was international territory. And under international law, the Polar Sentinel had every right to transit. If this level of tactical detail is what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed. We analyze military operations deeper than anyone else. At 10:15 a.m., frustration turned to aggression. The Admiral Golovko, refusing to accept defeat, increased speed to 28 knots and closed to within 200 yards of the Polar Sentinel's starboard side. The frigate's captain ordered his deck guns manned, 76 mm cannons swiveling to track the Icebreaker. It was a threat, clearly visible to American observers, but it was also a mistake. At 10:18 a.m., the Polar Sentinel's captain transmitted a radio message on emergency frequencies monitored by international maritime authorities. Russian warship Admiral Golovko is threatening a United States Coast Guard vessel conducting lawful transit in international waters. We are maintaining course and will defend ourselves if fired upon. The message, broadcast openly, ensured the world was watching. Any Russian attack would be documented, undeniable, and indefensible. Simultaneously, the USS Roosevelt went active on radar. Her AN-SPY-1D phased array system, capable of tracking 100 targets simultaneously, illuminated every Russian ship with targeting quality data. The message was unmistakable. Fire on the Icebreaker, and you will not survive the next 5 minutes. Russian commanders received the warning. Fire control radars from an American destroyer were locked onto their vessels. One missile launch, one torpedo in the water, and the entire Russian formation would be obliterated. The Admiral Golovko's captain, his hand hovering over the fire authorization button, hesitated. Moscow had ordered him to block the Americans, not start a war. At 10:22 a.m., he ordered his guns secured and turned away. The blockade was broken. The USCGC Polar Sentinel continued eastward, her bow smashing through ice at a steady 15 knots. The Russian warships, unwilling to risk escalation, fell back to their original positions, watching impotently as the American Icebreaker disappeared into the fog. Over the next 6 hours, the Polar Sentinel transited 180 miles of the northern sea route, documenting ice conditions, water depths, and navigational hazards. Her data, transmitted via satellite to the U.S. National Ice Center, would be shared with NATO allies and commercial shipping companies. The route was open. Russia's blockade was exposed as theater, incapable of stopping a determined opponent backed by military force. But America wasn't finished. At 4:30 p.m., as the Polar Sentinel emerged from the Arctic ice into open water near the Bering Strait, a second convoy appeared on Russian radar. 3 U.S. Navy logistics ships, escorted by another Arleigh Burke destroyer, entered the northern sea route from the east. Their cargo was humanitarian aid destined for Norway, but their route was deliberate. They would transit the entire length of the Northern Sea Route, demonstrating that American vessels could operate freely in waters Russia claimed to control. The Russian blockade, already humiliated once, faced a second challenge. This time, Moscow chose discretion. Orders were given to observe, but not interfere. The American convoy passed through without incident. By November 7th, the strategic situation had shifted irreversibly. Russia had deployed 15 warships, expended millions in fuel and operational costs, and achieved nothing. The Northern Sea Route remained open to international traffic. NATO members, emboldened by American resolve, announced joint Arctic naval exercises scheduled for the following spring. Norway and Denmark pledged to increase their icebreaker fleets. Canada accelerated construction of 3 heavy icebreakers under a defense partnership with the United States. The Arctic, which Russia had hoped to dominate through intimidation, was now contested by a coalition determined to preserve freedom of navigation. What would you have done if you were commanding the Russian blockade? Would you have escalated or stood down? Share your tactical analysis in the comments. The economic consequences were swift. Insurance rates for Northern Sea Route transits, which had spiked during the blockade, dropped to pre-crisis levels within 48 hours. Shipping companies that had rerouted through the Suez Canal began planning Arctic transits for the following summer. Maersk, the world's largest container shipping company, announced a feasibility study for regular Northern Sea Route service. The message was clear. Russia could not credibly close a route it didn't control militarily, and any attempt to do so would face American opposition backed by overwhelming force. Politically, the confrontation damaged Russia's standing with Arctic Council nations. Finland and Sweden, both recent NATO members, condemned the blockade as a violation of international law. Iceland granted expanded basing rights to U.S. aircraft conducting Arctic surveillance. Even China, which had invested billions in Arctic shipping infrastructure, privately expressed frustration with Russian actions that disrupted planned commercial routes. Moscow found itself isolated, its Arctic ambitions thwarted by a single American icebreaker and the credible threat of military retaliation. For the crew of the USCGC Polar Sentinel, the mission became legendary. They had stared down 15 Russian warships, maintained course through ice thick enough to crush lesser vessels, and proven that American resolve extended to the most remote waters on Earth. The captain received a commendation. The crew returned to port as heroes, and the icebreaker herself became a symbol of American commitment to defending international law, no matter how cold, how remote, or how contested the battlefield. But the deeper lesson was strategic. The Arctic, once considered a frozen wasteland of marginal importance, had become a theater of great power competition. Climate change was opening new shipping routes, exposing vast oil and gas reserves, and creating military choke points that could control global commerce. Russia, with the longest Arctic coastline and the largest icebreaker fleet, believed geography gave it dominance. November 2025 proved otherwise. Geography matters, but so do technology, alliances, and the willingness to defend principles with force. The United States, operating a single icebreaker supported by destroyers, had demonstrated that control of the Arctic would not be conceded to any nation, regardless of its geographic advantages. The confrontation also highlighted a critical vulnerability in Russian strategy. Moscow had built military capabilities designed to intimidate weaker opponents, fishing vessels, civilian cargo ships, nations without powerful navies. But against a peer adversary with advanced sensors, precision weapons, and disciplined crews, those capabilities were inadequate. The frigate captains, who attempted to block the Polar Sentinel, discovered that aggression without superiority is just recklessness. They had gambled that the Americans would blink first. They lost. For NATO, the Arctic confrontation validated years of investment in cold weather capabilities and interoperability. The USS Roosevelt and USS Porter, operating seamlessly with a Coast Guard icebreaker, demonstrated the value of joint training and common operating procedures. Communications were flawless. Coordination was precise. And the message to Russia was unified. NATO's Arctic presence, while smaller than Russia's, was technologically superior and tactically proficient. Any attempt to dominate the region through military force would fail. Environmental considerations also shaped the aftermath. The Northern Sea Route, while economically attractive, poses ecological risks. Oil spills in Arctic waters are nearly impossible to clean. Increased shipping threatens fragile ecosystems. Indigenous communities, whose survival depends on Arctic wildlife, expressed concerns about industrialization. The United States, while defending freedom of navigation, also committed to environmental monitoring and regulatory frameworks to minimize ecological damage. Russia, focused purely on economic and military control, had ignored these concerns. The contrast in approaches bolstered American credibility with environmental groups and indigenous representatives. As winter deepened and ice thickened, making further Arctic operations impractical until spring, both sides assessed the lessons. Russia recognized it needed better icebreakers, more capable sensors, and revised doctrine for Arctic confrontations. Plans were drawn for next-generation vessels, but budget constraints and technological limitations delayed implementation. The United States accelerated icebreaker construction, aiming for 6 heavy icebreakers by 2032. Congress, recognizing the strategic importance demonstrated in November, allocated funding without the usual partisan gridlock. The USCGC Polar Sentinel returned to her home port in Seattle to a hero's welcome. Crowds lined the docks, media coverage was extensive, and for a brief moment, Americans understood that defending freedom required not just aircraft carriers and fighter jets, but also the unglamorous work of breaking ice in waters so cold that exposed skin freezes in minutes. The crew, many of whom had served in obscurity for years, found themselves celebrated. Their mission, though bloodless, had been no less critical than any battle. They had enforced international law in the most hostile environment on Earth, and they had won without firing a shot. But the calm was deceptive. Russian military planners, humiliated by the blockade's failure, began developing new tactics for Arctic confrontations. Submarine deployments increased. Long-range bombers conducted more frequent patrols, and rhetoric from Moscow grew sharper, warning that future challenges to Russian Arctic interests would be met with force. The November confrontation had not resolved the underlying tensions. It had merely established that those tensions would be contested, not conceded. For the United States, the lesson was equally clear. Arctic dominance could not be assumed. It required sustained investment, allied cooperation, and the willingness to confront aggression wherever it occurred. The Polar Sentinel had proven American capability. But one icebreaker, no matter how capable, could not patrol an ocean. More vessels, more resources, and more attention to a theater long neglected were essential. The Arctic, once an afterthought in American defense planning, had become a priority. And with that priority came costs, commitments, and the recognition that future confrontations were inevitable. As the Arctic winter closed in, freezing the northern sea route until spring, both sides prepared for the next round. Russia would not abandon its claims. The United States would not concede freedom of navigation. And somewhere in the frozen expanse, where temperatures plunge below -40 and darkness lasts for months, the stage was set for future confrontations that would test resolve, technology, and the willingness of great powers to defend principles in the most unforgiving environment on Earth. The ice remembers November 2025. It remembers 15 Russian warships turned back by American determination. And it reminds us that the Arctic, silent and frozen, is now a battlefield where the next great power struggle will unfold. Now I want your input. First, was deploying just one icebreaker a brilliant show of confidence or a reckless gamble that could have gone wrong? Second, how important is control of the Arctic compared to traditional naval choke points like the Strait of Hormuz? Third, should the U.S. prioritize building more icebreakers or invest in submarines and aircraft for Arctic operations? Leave your strategic analysis in the comments. Every insight you share helps shape what we cover next. And if this deep dive into Arctic geopolitics gave you a new perspective on cold weather naval power, show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to this channel, and turning on notifications. Until next time, stay sharp, stay informed, and remember that freedom of navigation is defended everywhere, even where the ocean freezes solid.